Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns and this is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. And as usual, I'm using the translation that I did with Dr. Nancy Turner that came out a couple of years ago. We're up to Theorem 20, which is exciting because this is a theorem where, as I have mentioned often before, Dee seems to stumble into this mystical idea of a hypercube when there is no word for such a thing in England in 1564 and not even a concept of it. Now, we've looked already at this theorem in a couple of previous videos, but we're going to continue on here. Before I do that, though, I want to point out to those of you who are interested in the mystical records of John Dee, that is the so-called Enochian corpus, which I've also done a fair amount of work on and which is now out in the records and unabridged by Kevin Klein, then this theorem is of particular significance. And in fact, after I do this video, I'm going to have another one sometime before the end of the year looking at the connection between this theorem and the Great Table of Earth. But for now, let me just share my screen and we will get going looking at what I am going to call the New Jerusalem hypercube. That is, the way that Dee gets to these dimensions is by positing a cube in New Jerusalem, which is not at all unusual in his time. I think I will put this on slideshow, however, that might help. Okay, there we are. And you know the usual disclaimer here. I'm assuming you know who John Dee is. I'm assuming you know what the hieroglyphic monad is, that he's taking apart and putting together his symbol of everything. But beyond all that, I'm assuming that you understand it up to Theorem 20, that you're in a handful of people who have taken the time, and it takes time, not brilliance, to understand what's going on in the hieroglyphic monad. That means that you understand references to other cosmogenic texts like the Sefer Yetzirah and Plato's Timaeus, and of course the Bible. If you want to follow along with this class and don't know those things, I'm just glad you're here. Don't worry about it. There are 4 different playlists below that can help get you up to speed here, talking about everything from the letter to Maximilian, all the theorems up to 20, related text, and some wordplay. But for now, I'm just going to very quickly review the last video, and then we're going to jump into the mystical hypercube of Dr. John Dee. The last video, we looked at Dee's continuing work on conic sections. And as I mentioned then, and I want to stress even more this time, conic sections is the way he discusses it is not like the way he does anything else in the hieroglyphic monad. I mean, it's closest to Kabbalah, where we never actually get the tree that he's using and have to figure that out by the text he's referring to. But it's not really even like that, because Dee at least uses the word Kabbalah and he writes some things in Hebrew. Dee never even says the word conic sections. And he starts setting this up from Theorem 1 and 2, where we get the idea of geometric construction should always be done with compass and straight edge. We get it again in 6, 7, 8. We get the X as a 2-dimensional projection of a cube. We get it some more in 12, 13, and then in the LVX theorem, as I call it, Theorem 16, and then in Theorem 20. And that was the whole last video, which was nearly an hour long. That is his correct mathematical solution about conic sections, specifically the doubling of the cube problem with 2 parabolas. Now, this begs the question, as I said in much more detail before, about why is Dee so secretive about conic sections? And I talked about the realpolitik behind that, the very useful implications of parabolas and parabolic mirrors, and parabolas as used in optics and in ballistics in terms of military operations, and the very bad relations between England and Spain at that time, compounded by Elizabeth I becoming the Queen. She is, of course, Dee's main patron. And although we know that he is writing this to Maximilian, he is working for Elizabeth. And there are a lot of people back in 1564, 2 decades before the Spanish Armada, who are kind of playing both sides against the middle. More on all of that in the last video. And more on the wonderful world of parabolas in the last video. But I did mention that C.H. Jostin, who did the last scholarly translation before Dr. Turner and I, that he speculated that the hieroglyphic monad once included an oral teaching. And in fact, he said it was not understandable without that. I don't agree with him, obviously, on that latter point, or I wouldn't be doing these videos. But I do agree about the former, that there was some oral teaching to initiates. I would simply say there were two initiates. There were scientists, mathematicians. That's the first group. And that's what this continuing layer about conic sections is about. Things that are kind of top secret math and science then, because of their use in military operations. And they may even have been secret in that they use this secret thing called algebra, which is no secret now. You learn it in high school or before if you're really good at math. If you're like me, you learn it in high school and then forget it for 40 years, and then you have to relearn it to understand the hieroglyphic monad. Anyway, that aside, that layer continues till the very end. You don't get the right measurements to make it work until Theorem 23. But the more commonly thought of group of initiates would be the kind of Rosicrucian Christian Kabbalist magical initiates interested in fusing Christian Kabbalah and sacred geometry. And that's the group that this solution of the theorem would be aimed at, because what I'm going to talk about here, unlike in the last video, is something that mathematically doesn't work, but it's fascinating in how it connects mystically to the kind of things he's doing in his later mystical work with Edward Kelly. There's a couple of great ironies in this too, I just have to say. One that is that you're getting in this theorem, I would say, and in the LBX theorem that is used as the signs of the adepts in modern esoterica. You could look at it, if you wanted to be a bit cynical, as a cover story for what he's really talking about, which is conic sections, which is, you don't need a cover story now. Basically, in the US, you kind of have to know it to get into college. I mean, it's not a secret. It's something you're supposed to learn. It's a thing called algebra. Anyway, the other twist on that, though, is it's his cover story that's of greater interest to me, and that I think has been of greater interest to people in the Western mystery tradition. So that's what I'm talking about in this video. His transcendental fourth dimensional solution. If the first solution was mathematical, involving real mathematics, this next one is going to be anagogical. And this solution, as I said, has great implications for his later work with Edward Kelly. So just remember from last time, I won't repeat the whole thing here, that we were leaning on an article by Wilson looking at how Dee solves the Delian problem. I'll run you through that real quick in a sec, but the way that it's solved is if you look at this monad glyph, and this is the illustration right out of Wilson's article in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition, you get an idea of, oh, this monad describes a parabola. There, that dot in the middle is the focus. This line is the directrix. That's what you need to define a parabola. Every parabola is similar to every other parabola, and there is a certain solution that is usually today expressed algebraically, but would not have been back in ancient Greece. It might have been expressed by measuring things with a string and pins. But it is that if you define one parabola, and you are defining it by using a mean proportion that you've got, then you come up with another mean proportion. You're going to graph something else that's going to be orthogonal, that is at a right angle to the first parabola. It's going to share the same axis of symmetry, which is what this would represent, and intersect at the axis of symmetry with the other parabola. All that's in the last video. In the article, what Wilson suggests, and I agree with, is that in his text here and his purported attempt to solve the doubling of the cube problem, that Dee stumbles onto the concept of higher dimensions. Now, I agree with that, but I think what happens is that Dee actually gives you two solutions. One that is correct, the one I discussed last video, and one that will help people in the Western mystery tradition do a number of things, like, oh, since we've had 4 elements and there are 5, and the 5th is the ether, and that gets associated in the Western mystery tradition with the spirit part of the pentagram, all this kind of thing, that it helps bring the ether back into sacred geometry in the Western mystery tradition. But as a mathematical solution, I just want to stress, like, this doesn't hold up mathematically as the doubling of the cube in any way. What it does is it describes a hypercube. Also, I want to add that the way Dee does this by doing evoking the idea of New Jerusalem is not bringing in a concept that is anything but a commonplace. Describing New Jerusalem then or today was a commonplace among apocalyptic Christians. Also, the measurements of the actual Temple of New Jerusalem is of particular interest to Rosicrucians in the era that just followed Dee. You may have heard of things like the Neometria, which means measurements of the temple, of Simon Studion, where he argues in excruciating and not to me terribly interesting detail about what those measurements ought to be, and uses it to prophesy a bunch of things. Of course, the end of the world is one of them. And then you get drawings of this, like this French tapestry, where here is New Jerusalem descending in the Golden Age after the earth has fallen. So that's a common concept that Dee is playing on in this particular solution. Now, is there a representation of New Jerusalem that also solves the Delian problem? No, there's not. But there is one Dee is going to do that is going to stumble onto a hypercube. Just remember that here's the ruins of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, but remember what the Delian problem was, that either because there was a plague or the citizens were fighting, or that, as Plato is supposed to have said in the Platonicus, that people have just not studied their math and they have contempt for geometry, and this upsets Apollo. Whatever the reason, Apollo tells the Oracle of Delphi that what the citizens need to do is double the volume of their cubical altar right here. That is one perhaps source of a double cubical altar that some of you may have heard of before, and we will get several others in this video and the one that I do when I talk more about this in terms of the Great Table of Earth. Okay, so the Delian problem is just one of the three famous unsolvable problems in ancient Greek geometry. You've heard me talk about it before. Also about how Dee has been interested in it, has claimed to solve it in his Propoitomata Aphoristica, which was 120 theorems, and he wrote that before the Hieroglyphic Monad. After the Monad, he writes the introduction to the first English translation of Euclid, and he implies there that he solved this problem of the doubling of the cube. That's very interesting because modern mathematicians have proven that you can't solve it with a compass and straight edge, and you can't solve it because it involves an irrational non-Euclidean number, basically the cubed root of 2. But if we were to say the Delian problem and what it is completely, that it is the doubling of the volume of the cube, that's been solvable for 2 millennia. As I talked about before, you just can't solve it only using a compass and straight edge. Hippocrates of Chios solved it, Menachmus solved it. It may be through trying to solve this that Menachmus came up with what we now call a parabola and what we now call the geometric study of conic sections. And we solve this today with basic algebra, even though, of course, they didn't solve it then. They figured it out probably with rope and string. I do want to mention something that one of the great historians of math and science of the last generation, J.L. Heilbron, points out as a preface to Wayne Shoemaker's translation of Dee's Propoitomata Aphoristica. Heilbron is noting how much Dee is working with conic sections there. Shoemaker notes that too, and says that it seems like Dee, when he hints at this problem, is equivocating a little bit. Now, Heilbron doesn't know that Dee has ever anywhere solved the problem, but he knows that Dee is claiming in places that he solved the problem. That's what he means by Dee equivocating, which can mean lying. It can also just mean a kind of sleight of hand. And I don't think Dee lies. It's just that in the opening preface to the first English translation of Euclid, there is a definite sleight of hand where Dee is saying, you need to solve things with compass and straight edge. That's what the Greeks did. So then when he claims to have solved the Delian problem, you would think he solved it with compass and straight edge. Well, he hasn't. He solved it with parabolas. So you can see how that's a kind of sleight of hand, but it is also, I think, quite possible that he wasn't permitted to say how he solved it. So either, you were part of the group of scientific initiates or you weren't. Anyway, we're back to these 2 paragraphs again for the 3rd time, and I swear on my heart that this is the last time we're going to look at these 2 paragraphs. Let's go through them here. D says, we have sufficiently demonstrated above, that was in Theorem 6 and 7, using in good faith hieroglyphical calculations that the elements are signified by straight lines. Still, we will here relate a most exact exploration of the almost central point of our cross. Now, in Wilson's article, Wilson goes through these two paragraphs and puts in brackets, as I've done here, what Wilson thinks that D means by, say, the point of the cross. But even Wilson, who recognizes what D is doing, has to work in a kind of fudge factor. What we want to do here is get rid of the fudge factor. So the central point of the cross would seem to be the focus. And if you follow my cursor, it would be there, the middle of the sun symbol, right? And that is, in fact, what Wilson treats as the focus in saying, here's a directrix, you know, here's the focus, the parabola comes like that. It's great, that works out. But what D is talking about here is not that little dot. D is talking about down here in the cross of the elements and the little intersection point there that he's separated out various places. So what Wilson says is, well, there's the implication, and this is true, many places, that you should lift your eyes up. So maybe you're lifting your eyes up from this point to this point. Okay, you can read it that way, but I don't even see any need to do that, because this doubling the cube thing that turns into a hypercube isn't mathematically viable anyway. It only works as a really cool metaphor or as a hypercube, but not the doubling of the cube. And yeah, if you're a super mathematician out there and you know that, wait a minute, one two-dimensional projection of the hypercube looks like a doubled cube, and it's like, okay, I'm not even willing to impute that much back on D. I will to, say, some early 20th century esotericists who pick it up as an idea of the double cubical altar, but let's just have D only doing so many remarkable things. So what I want to suggest is, as we're entering this for the third and last time, that we make the central point of the cross, that we realize D is talking about the cross, the elements, the intersecting point, but for that first one to work, it had to be this central point up here. And by the time we get to this theorem, we're going to have to get rid of one of those 2 points. So we might assume, since we've also associated this cross of the elements with Malkuth, the earth, fallen humans, that it might be this one at the bottom that we're going to get rid of, because in fact, that'll be true. Okay, then he continues on and says, as concerns our ternary, and you know by now that many times he's used ternary. Ternary just means any group of 3. So Wilson has it mean body, mind, and spirit. It can also mean the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. It can mean 3 anything, you know, apple pie, cherry pie, and blueberry pie. It's a group of 3. Quaternary is a group of 4. Binary, a group of 2. All right. As concerns our ternary, that point can in no way be absent from that place in our binary, group of 2. But since we have had that emerald tablet sandwich, so to speak, between 14 and 19, and we have gone through some rather complicated things framed by restatements of the emerald tablet, where the sun and the moon create the one thing, and as above is like things which are below, things below like things that are above. I would suggest that as above, so below is one pretty logical ternary, especially since D has been talking about hypostasis, and he talks about it again here. And we have that hypostatic theological idea in Catholicism of D's time of Jesus. Hypostasis is the idea that Jesus is both perfectly human and perfectly divine. The word in ancient Greek just means underlying substance. All right, so Wilson suggests you can also make binary mean the duplication process. Very true, whether you're doubling a cube or you're having a parabola that's orthogonal to the other parabola. If in fact someone unskilled in divine mathesis were to contend that it, that is the focus or the displaced point, is absent, then let him suppose it's absent. What remains will not be our binary, but because of the removal of that point and the resulting break in the unity of the line, a quaternary emerges. But our antagonist has supposed with us that a binary would remain. There would be, therefore, by this same line of thinking, a binary which is identical to the quaternary. Okay, stop here for a moment. Antagonist, as Wilson reads it, and this will work, is just kind of like a devil's advocate, you know, like you're talking to yourself. Well, let's suppose this happened. Well, if this happens, then that will happen. Okay, that works fine. Now, if you want a really heretical reading, you can look at this also as an allusion to adversary, which, since it's heretical, is why he would not say adversary. Remember, all the way through here, he's skating on the edge of heresy. And if you understand this, it's actually truly heretical. So why would you say adversary? The devil? There's not a devil in the Bible. No, but in Dee's time, the adversary is commonly thought of as Lucifer, a fallen angel, the light bringer. Remember, in the Codex Marcianus and the Tuba Philosophorum, all the bit about fallen angels. The Book of Enoch, which is not the same thing as Dee's later Enochian work, but it's related. But the fallen angels talked about, for example, by Zosimus of Panopolis, or Amniel, the angel in Isis the prophetess, to her son Horus. So since light, the light of the cross is the central focus here, or if we think of the middle pillar as light coming down the middle pillar, and Lucifer is the angel who is the light bringer, who just happens to be a fallen angel down here on earth, you can see how that would work really well to have the antagonist be an allusion to the adversary and Lucifer. However, if that upsets you, just forget that I said it. It's just the reading is there for those who want it. Who want it. When Dee says at the end of this paragraph, this clearly enough is powerless, remember I mentioned a couple videos ago, he says the word powerless in ancient Greek, which says, pay attention. And this word has been mistranslated, sadly, by everyone who has translated the monad until Dr. Turner and I. Powerless is the way Dee writes it is a very unusual Greek word. The only place I can find it even existing is in a very significant place, that is at the end of the 24th chapter, 24 theorems here, 24 hours in a day, 12 times 2, all that, of the first book of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios, which is about astronomy and astrology. And what it means by powerless, it's how a celestial light is rendered powerless. That is, it's up in the sky and it exerts some force or some power upon the earth, according to that thinking, and it's powerless when it's either behind the earth or it's behind some other celestial object in the sky, so that we don't get any of its light. Okay, let's continue on here. Then Dee says, therefore, out of all necessity must the point be present, because along with the binary, it constitutes our ternary, and nothing else can be substituted in its place. This is, again, dealing with this rectilinear cross. So the binary are these lines, 1, 2. If you add the point where they cross, which is not part of the lines, but it's the intersection of the lines, that's a ternary. If you displace the point, then this is no longer a binary, it's a quaternary. You have, Dee says, 4 lines. We'd actually today call them rays, but anyway, you have 4 things there. All right. Then Dee says it's not of a hypostatic property itself, nor in any other way part of the binary. Now, this is where Dee can do another nifty little sleight of hand, which is, in the 1st century AD in Alexandrian Egypt, you get the use of hypostasis as a mathematical property. Again, it's just a Greek word that means underlying substance, and the center of Greek language and culture in the 1st century and through 3rd century AD is Alexandria, Egypt. So hypostasis in math just means things that share an underlying substance, like a line is hypostatic to a line, a point is hypostatic to a point, and so on. So if the point can make up a ternary here, but the point isn't a line, so it doesn't share the hypostatic property of the line. That is not part is here demonstrated. All parts of a line are lines, which sounds like just mumbo jumbo, but it's actually directly out of Euclid. Anything that is a line and everything on that line is a line. It's all hypostatic, but it's hypostatic to a line. So then Dee says, yet the hypothesis confirms that it's a point. Therefore, it's not by any way part of the binary, right? It's a point, it's not a line. Much less of the hypostatic property of a binary, where all parts of a line are lines, but this isn't a part of the line, it's a point. I know points are made up of lines, that's what I mean by a kind of equivocation. Accordingly, we are especially noting that it has its own hypostasis and nonetheless is contained in those linear links of the binary. its own hypostasis just means it's hypostatic to another point. Now you're getting an idea how this point below is going to merge or do something with this point above, because they share the same underlying essence. We've seen that he's played about with this before with the concept of the light of the cross, or the light of the Christos, Yod He Shin Vav He, that you are trying from this point in Malkuth to move up the middle pillar to Tiferet. Accordingly, we're especially noting it has its own hypostasis and nonetheless is contained in those linear links of our binary. And since it is seen in this way to be common to both, it receives itself a certain secret image of the binary. You can, if you want, jump into that whole thing and connect it back to a secret image of the cross, a secret that is below, or you can connect it to the receptacle and the Timaeus. I'll just leave you to explore that on your own. And you can, remember, equate the receptacle from the Timaeus to Bina. And here from that place, we demonstrate the quaternary reposing within the ternary. Okay, well, that's interesting. And then he does the thing we've seen twice before when we got to the end of the second paragraph, where he suddenly asks God to forgive him if he has revealed too much. But hopefully God will forgive him if only people understand it who are worthy. And it seems that he's not making sense, because the point has the central part of the cross, which is light, LVX, light in Latin, which you can equate to the sun, the Christos, the sun, SUN, gold, Tiferet, is up here. And he's talking about something below, earth, Malkuth, a fallen human. And the Christos is supposed to be the focus, right? Not those who are trying to become the Christos. Actually, it's both. That's the little sleight of hand that he has done with hypostasis here. The hypostatic point, property of the point, make it share the substance of that other point. So you in effect have the fallen human made of the same substance as what is above. And we've seen that same thing explored in our nature begets nature, and only a lion can beget a lion kind of thing. Only something with substance of the divine can be begotten by the divine. All right, continuing on. After D asks God to forgive him if he sinned by revealing too much, he says, let us now proceed to that quaternary which we have assigned to our cross. We would consider whether that point that is represented there can be absent. Now, in fact, it's going to need to be absent to make a hypercube. Mathematics actually teaches us that it can be removed, for not only does our quaternary remain when the central point has been separated, but the quaternary has been made far more distinct and clear for all eyes. Sure, I mean, you take the point out, it's easier to tell that there's four things there. But he's going to do more here. Now, this isn't Sunday school, okay? I don't think hypercubes are particularly Christian, like I said, but you're going to get bunches of allusions to Bible quotes here. I'm only going to give you a few. If you want to search for more of these, there's a lot more online, trust me. When D says, no part of it, the point, substantial proportion has disappeared, but the superfluous and confounding point of union is thus judged and rejected. If you read the Bible at all, you probably recognize that as an allusion to something. It's an allusion to many things. In her German translation, Agnes Klein says that it's referring to something from Peter, where Christ is referred to as a living stone, rejected by men, but precious and chosen by God. And Peter's name, of course, Petrus, also means stone. There is a habit that I have mentioned among Christians of Dee's era and among some today, of looking at the Old Testament as prefiguring the New Testament. So then you have several different Old Testament quotes that prefigure this New Testament idea. In the Psalms, for example, the stone the builders rejected had become the cornerstone. There is something similar in the book of Isaiah. And which New Testament verse does it prefigure? Well, there's multiple ones with this idea of the rejected stone. Take this one in Acts. This is the stone which you builders have rejected, and he, Jesus, is the cornerstone. There's some fascinating thing here that D would immediately know, because he's reading the New Testament in Greek. In his library catalog, for example, there's not even a Latin Vulgate. I mean, he has Greek New Testaments. And so in Greek, cornerstone, not all of the time, but sometimes, and Acts is one, is actually literally head of the corner. Now remember that rectilinear cross again. There is something that none of you called me on in the comments. I was sort of hoping somebody would, but no one did. And that's, if you have this rectilinear cross and you displace that central point, then something weird is going to happen when you do the flipping, because rectilinear means right angle. So if we flip these right angles in the center out and we get a square, I've said, and you can flip the square into a cube, and you can, except that if you've taken that middle point out, I guess you could say theoretically what you do is have almost a square, except all the corner points are missing. But wait, if you want to be a super Christian, and D is nothing if not a super Christian, then, well, that's because the head of the corner is Christ, and you put the head of the corner back in each of the cornerstones, and you have a square, and then you can flip it into a cube. Anyway, something that kind of metaphysical Christians even today have pointed out is that there are quotes like this one in Matthew that don't make it necessarily seem like that this cornerstone quote is directed at Jesus, but is directed instead at the anointed one, whomever the anointed one may be. So Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So the idea there would be, it's the LVX, the light of the cross, the light of God, not just Jesus. It's any anointed one who understands that the things that are going on there. There's other places where Jesus says, I am, like I am the light, I am the fountain, I am the life. Jesus never says, I am the cornerstone. Okay, quick review of a couple other things back from Theorem 6, which is what Dee was referring to at the beginning of that paragraph, that idea of rectilinear. Theorem 6 would be associated with Tifereth, you realize, after you get past Theorem 10, and that's where this middle point here was most logically associated with, even though what we're getting here is a cube. That is the cross of the elements more likely associated with Malkuth. So in a square, which you get if you flip the right angles, you get 4 corners, 4 right angles in a square, 8 vertices in a regular hexahedron or cube. The vertices make another ternary. The center of the cube, this dot in the middle, would be a septenary. So if you flipped this rectilinear cross out, that displaced point that would be the center would be first the center of the square, then the center of the cube. Some other things about cubes. A cube has 12 edges. Of course, it's in these terms, it's a ternary multiplied by a quaternary. It also mirrors important time measures like months or signs in the zodiac. Even if you break up one sign in the zodiac into 12ths, you get a construction called a dodecatomore that we saw, I think, back in Theorem 11 when he's talking about Aries of Aries, when time begins. Today, astrologers tend to talk about decanates, but there was this 1/12 of a sign thing used in Dee's time. Remember also back to the Timaeus that in the world of being, the world of perfect forms, there are all these fractions you get as things take form and then are perfect forms before they go through the receptacle to go into the world of being. In that, 12 is a common measure. So is 2, 3, 6, and 8. There are never any 7s, and 7s become really important in the world of becoming, like the 7 classical planets that are gods and goddesses are keeping order of the chaos 7 days of the week and so on. But you exist in the world of becoming. So if you are trying to imagine this perfect form in the world of becoming, then you're kind of the 7th point there. You can also associate cubes with the sacred geometry of the Sefer Yetzirah. I'll drop in a link to that below, a wonderful article by Dr. Jeffrey Kupperman. Later esoteric groups use it, most famously Paul Foster Case's Bota, although some argue with good reason that perhaps they're not making the exact attributions that they ought to from the Sefer Yesera. That's another discussion. There were also others like Order of the Cubic Stone in England. Anyway, a cube is a regular platonic solid, usually associated with the element earth. And it happens to unfold as a cross, as we saw back in 6. That is, if you unfold that three-dimensional object into a 2D, a group of squares in 2D, you get 6 squares. Now let's add in a few more things, since this theorem is going to refer directly to the book of Revelations, and that's important both here and in Dee's later Enochian work. You can look at the book of Revelation in the Bible generally as at all the significance of all the number 12 tribes of Israel, but not only that in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, I mean, there were 12 apostles, but not only that. And in Revelation, which is so symbolically dense, there's all kinds of 12s. Probably the most famous ones would be, if you think of the woman of Revelation, the woman with the dragon and the sun and the moon, and she has a crown of 12 stars, or 144,000 humans that are saved, that being 12 times 12. And if we're used to doing gematria, we just drop off all the zeros. Also, there is the habit in Dee's era, as well as in our own among apocalyptic Christians, of looking at heavenly Jerusalem in Revelation as a cube and using the numbers and symbolism in Revelation and associating them with the measurement of a temple of New Jerusalem and arguing about it. You can find all this online, like this equals 15,000 miles. No, it's 150,000. Well, it should be in kilometers, whatever. There's lots of discussion about that if you don't know it. So Wilson suggests that you get the cube for a couple of reasons. First of all, that whatever the measurements of New Jerusalem, they're going to be large. They're going to be larger than the measurements of this Earth cube. So you get an idea of a larger cube on the outside and a smaller cube on the inside. You don't, first of all, like, I'm not going to enter into the argument about what the actual measurements of the New Jerusalem cube are. I'm only going to treat it as a metaphor. But if you tried to do that and get measurements that would work and come up with measurements of the middle cube, great. I mean, none of them I tried worked, and I'm like I said, I'm interested in this as a hypercube, not in whether New Jerusalem is descending or not. But then, if you realize Dee has created this implicit cube below, and he is via this point in the middle, which would be this fallen human in Malkuth, because we're in the fallen world and we're all, by this line of thought, fallen humans. Then the connection that point is making, the outer cube to New Jerusalem, is a connection through time. And so that's how Wilson makes these connections to a hypercube. I think we might instead say space-time. I mean, yes, that's an Einsteinian concept that doesn't exist in Dee's era, but a hypercube doesn't exist in Dee's era. However, if one is Neoplatonic enough to think, well, the structure of a hypercube exists as a perfect form, whether you recognize it or not, then we're on solid ground. Metaphoric solid ground? Anyway, your mileage may vary. Let's continue on here. Dee says, no part of the point's substantial proportion has disappeared, but the superfluous and confounding point of union is judged and rejected. And then he continues, oh, omnipotent majesty, we mortals are compelled to acknowledge what great wisdom and what infinity of ineffable mysteries are contained in thy smallest jots and tittles. A few things here. Dee is continuing to overlay this idea of hypostatic union, the religious and mathematical ones together. How the point from the cross of the elements below, down here, becomes rejected on Earth because Earth is going to fall away. And we could think of this also as, if you are anointing yourself in this particular age, remember his discussion about world ages, then it's going to move up the middle pillar and merge with this point from the ternary or the trinity above. That point becomes the crowning or anointed point of that cross. So the LBX point is now at Tiferet. Jots and tittles, just in case you don't remember, he used these same words in the letter to Maximilian. But this is from the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, where Jesus says, "For truly I say unto you, till heaven and earth perish," in the book of Revelation, "one jot or one tittle of the law shall not escape till all things be fulfilled." A jot is just the smallest of letters. It doesn't have a real Latin or English equivalent. It just means really little. The Latin Vulgate Bible uses a Greek iota for it. Anyway, a tittle is a combination of tiny and little. It's even smaller. Usually it's a mark above letters in writing. Then the letter to Maximilian D is equating it to iodes and hierarchs and an apex. Here he's equating it with a point. He's going to get a copulative point again, lest you think he was only interested in that in Theorem 15. So let's continue. Ineffable mysteries contained in thy smallest jots and tittles, as described and set out in thy law, if the greatest terrestrial and arcane secrets can be explained and most faithfully demonstrated through the diverse indicators of this one single point, which has been picked out and examined by me, though in thy light, namely of a point which is in no way superfluous in the divine ternary, yet which, when considered within the realm of the four elements, is indeed foul, corruptible, and dark. Oh, 3 and 4 times blessed are those who can reach that, shall we say, copulative point of the ternary. Why is it copulative? Well, if this is the ternary and this point is moving up there and being anointed with it, it's either merging with it or copulating with it, or copulating is just another way that we're saying merging. Remember back in Isis the prophetess to her son Horus, which is the most likely referent to that nature rejoices in nature quote that he gives in ancient Greek. And we talked about how he had a copy of the Codex Marcianus. Isis learns the secret of everything from this fallen angel, Omniel, that exists nowhere else. It seems like a sexual union, although you could also look at it as an energetic merging. Then she teaches the same thing to her son, Horus, who used to be her husband, and the whole thing seems to be taking place in the underworld. So that's the idea of copulating that Dee has been building up, or generative points. Even had a generative rather than genitive grammatical case, if you recall. So in doing this, he's suggesting that this great thing he is talking about, this anointment or being the anointed one, is attainable by individual humans, that they, like the displaced point, can achieve hypostatic union that connects above and below. Kind of cool, really. So a Tiphoretic nature rejoices in nature is what you're looking at here. The quaternary or the cross of the elemental world falls away into darkness, and you kind of enter this Tiphoretic space. Those of you who are ceremonial magicians know that some people who do Enochian ceremonial magic do so from a Tiphoretic space. Well, if you connect this theorem to some other ideas that are associated with the Great Table of Earth, you understand why, though I'm not going to digress off for a couple hours on that right now. You've probably studied it somewhere else, or else just forget I said it. All right, so then he continues and says, "Thus we will attain the snow-white clarity and the white robes of regalia, O Maximilian, whom God, to the honor of his tremendous name, may in time to come make mighty by this mystagogy, or someone else from the House of Austria, while I assuredly sleep in Christ during this, that abominable and finally intolerable darkness of the point which is superfluous on earth." Well, we'll do this backwards. The point that is superfluous on earth, because earth is so dark, actually seems to be the Tiphoretic point. What Dee is doing here is alluding directly to Revelations 4:4. And in Revelations 4:4, if you look it up, you get a description where surrounding the throne, and Jesus is sitting on the throne. So around the throne go 24 other thrones, and seated on them are 24 elders. 2 times 12, by the way, and 24 theorems here. And let's see, we had this woman crowned by 12 stars. We're in the world of echoing 12s now. These elders are dressed in white, and it seems like Basically, Dee is telling Maximilian that he's going to become one of these 24 elders, which is probably not a bad thing to say to the person who is most likely to become the Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact, 6 months after this does. Of one other note to those of you interested in Dee's spiritual diaries, the word he uses in Latin, seniors, is usually translated as elders, but Dee himself translated it as seniors. So if you know what Enochian seniors are in his later spirit diaries after this vision Kelly has that reforms the tablets, you get Enochian seniors and you get everything set up based on something in the book of Revelation. So that's the same Enochian seniors on the Great Table of Earth that some of you charge with 4 hexagrams. 4 times 6 is another 24. Probably no accident either, although I might suggest a way that you could do it differently in my Enochian class. Mystagogy. Mystagogy is just the interpretation of the mysteries, the final period of initiation where the meaning of the sacraments are explained to those who have received them. It's why when people are baptized in certain Christian denominations, they wear white. It's behind the traditional idea of a bride wearing white. It's connected to the idea of a hierophant of the mysteries in a modern esoteric order wearing white. Not in the Eleusinian mysteries, because actually we don't know what they wore. But you can see some of the echoes going back and forth here. When Dee is talking about the House of Austria, he just means the House of Habsburg. That's the house that Maximilian belongs to. Another side note here, 2 decades later, or not, in 1583, Dee and Kelly are in Prague. That's where the Holy Roman Emperor of that time, Rudolph II, is. And so Dee gets an audience with Rudolph II and gives Rudolph II a copy of the Hieroglyphic Monad. And he refers directly to this theorem, he says, when he talks to Rudolph II, suggesting perhaps that if Maximilian wasn't the Habsburg who's going to be one of the 24 elders, perhaps the theorem is referring to Rudolph II. So again, if you want to know more about all of that, Dee's mystical records are the place to find it. And when I finish everything on the Hieroglyphic Monad, I'll return to those. They are really fascinating. All right, let me get a drink of water here. So if we keep going here, when Dee says sleep in Christ, he just means after he dies. And if you look at this in Latin, by the way, that's really, really cumbersome Latin. And his weird Latin syntax probably comes from wanting to use the Latin perfect form because he's talking to Maximilian about Maximilian. And so what does he do? He uses the Latin perfect form, which ends in istus, 3 times, no doubt alluding to the Ternary and the Holy Trinity. Moving on. We are, ladies and gentlemen, to the last paragraph. I bet you thought we'd never get there. And what he will do in this last paragraph at first is just repeat some ideas that he's basically talked about before. He says, so that I don't now pour out words that are superfluous, I'll retreat back into the lattice of my argument. And by lattice is just the structure. The structure of his argument is the hieroglyphic monad. And then he's going to, let's see if I can get this out of the way here. So he's delivering his speech and he says, I must now direct my oration to those whose hearts are still projecting from their eyes. I've mentioned that there are various layers here that I haven't taken the time to go into. One is the association of the heart with Tiferet. And you can also go into the Timaeus and find associations of the heart that would easily, that would be compatible with the association of the heart with Tiferet. There you get the heart as the seat of the soul, the century of justice in the mortal soul, and so on. So I know that modern day esotericists, myself among them, use concepts borrowed from the East, like chakras. But with the heart, I mean, you don't actually have to do that. There are things in both the Timaeus and the Sefer Yetzirah that would associate some of the concepts there with heart. What we have just said can be ever represented by the figure of a cross drawn here, first concerning the point which is necessary in each of the two comparable lines, equally and unequally divided, as shown here in A. Next in B, you see 4 distinct straight lines with a vacuity where that certain superfluous point has been. And that's what I had there in an easier to look at form and clicked off. But the 4 distinct straight lines have a vacuity where that certain superfluous point has been seemingly removed, that without suffering any damage has been separated from the place which once they shared in common. This is the way our monad, by consisting of 2 things, in progressing through the ternary and purified quaternary, is itself restored to oneness. So our monad is the whole thing, but remember what he's built up on this before. If you just have the circle and the dot, that's a Pythagorean symbol of a monad. And you get that Pythagorean symbol of a monad, if you overlay that back on the Pythagorean cosmogenesis, the Timaeus, by the world of being piercing the world of becoming. We've had all kinds of piercing things. Aries pierces things. Stillbone, Mercury pierce things with their point, and so on. So, and we can make world of being and becoming the 2 things. We can make it the Christos and the fallen world, all kinds of things we've talked about before. That is to say, the whole is all of its parts. And while this is taking place, our monad admits nothing external to its unity or number. In connection with itself, it is most exactly sufficient unto itself and most absolutely complete in all of its numbers. It is at that time in magical ways poured out in abundance. So this is the light of Tiferet poured down the middle pillar. And the LVX light of the cross is now situated at Tiferet. And afterwards, through the diligent artistry of a master and great exertion on the part of the monad itself, of course, the master is D, right? D is not the most humble person ever. In dignity and power, it is restored to its first and own matter, while in the meantime, the dregs that do not belong to its genuine and hereditary observed proportion have been cut loose and rejected for eternity. So if above, another binary we could do is if above, or New Jerusalem, or the restored golden age, is the same cube with volume doubled, and that larger cube is containing the smaller cube, and you connect the cubes by time, you in effect have a 4D hypercube. If you make the center point the septenary, that is an individual consciousness moving up the middle pillar and then merging with that Tiferetic point, what you're going to get in another way is you're going to have it rotating through its own center, which is what a hypercube does. That's implicitly adding another twist to the emerald tablet. So you could say D's addition to the emerald tablet, as above, so below, is as within, so without, because that's what will be happening here, and not only here if we look at some of his later work. The dregs, by the way, that's alchemical language. We could also say the dross. The dross is burned out, that point falls away, and the point below becomes the point above. So I showed you that one picture before of New Jerusalem. You get lots of artist views of New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And then you can get some people who think they are biblical purists correcting them. And I will tell you why. It's because it's supposed to be a cube. It's because the idea is that the length, width, and height of New Jerusalem are all the same, which would be a perfect cube. And by the way, you get 3 gates around things around each side. There's 4 sides, so that's another 12, lots of 12s, as I said. You can find other measurements in Revelation with Google Christian websites about it. But whatever the measurement of this huge cube, it's really, really large. It's going to be way more than double the volume. So this doesn't solve the Delian problem, although it may be of great spiritual or religious significance. What it does, though, is give you a description of a cube rotating through a point in the middle, which is essentially a hypercube. So something like this. And let's see here, my hypercube isn't rotating, so let me go back and get my hypercube to rotate. Okay, well, I guess if I don't have it on slideshow, we can make this rotate. One thing you may well know this already, but when you are looking at drawings of hypercube, since what this is essentially a projection into 2D of something that's supposed to be 4D, these cubes don't look like cubes; they're squished, right? And there are even projections you can make where some of them appear to vanish because there are places that where you can't see them in the projection. But the idea is that you're adding a perpendicular. So down below here, you have one dimension, which is a point, and then it becomes a line. You add a perpendicular, it becomes a square. You add another perpendicular, it becomes a cube. Then you add a fourth perpendicular, and it becomes a hypercube. So that's what he is describing here. A hypercube with the focus point being the LVX, light of the cross. If you consider the tree of life fractal, which most people do, and so you have a whole tree in Malkuth, then you would associate the focus point with the heart. You can associate it with divine substance. That's the Christ glue that Wilson is talking about when in the article I referred you to. So that's how John Dee falls into the mystical idea of a hypercube. It's just one step after this to bring back the fifth element, the dodecahedron associated with the ether. And that is what we're going to wind up doing the very next time that we look at a theorem in Theorem 21. We could also do it with this theorem, but I'll just pull the things from this theorem into the discussion of 21 because we've probably by now talked about this theorem enough. Okay, I'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.